Thank you for joining our latest LEAP episode. Today we had the opportunity to sit down with John Donahue. John has held several senior leadership positions over the years in his vast amount of experience in the container and logistics industry. Currently, he's the VP of Business Development for Port City Logistics and has such a passion for talking about personnel development, cost savings, and subjects like networking. So we hope you get a lot of value out of this video today, and thank you so much for tuning in. John, thank you for being here. It's a pleasure having you on this podcast. We're really excited to talk about your career and some lessons that you can share with younger logistics professionals.
Thanks for having me here. I'm excited.
Yes, sir. So you've had quite an extensive and illustrious career so far. You've worked in many states with many different organizations. I'm curious, though, just turning back the clock a bit, what was your barrier to entry in shipping?
Coming out of a small school in New England, interviews on campus, they had a relationship with the old United States lines, and I was very curious to get into a program that offered some fundamental training. You learn a lot in college, but you're not really ready for the work world. I knew that right away, and I said, I want to go somewhere where there's training. So I looked at some bigger companies with training, but U.S. Lines, there was people that I knew there that were already in the industry, a couple of years ahead of me, and I saw the outline for the training program, and I said, what an opportunity. Get away from home. I always made a commitment that when I graduate college, I'm not going to live at home. I'm going to move. And, I was able to get into the training program and assigned immediately to Houston, Texas, and that's where everything started. And in the U.S. Lines training program, you had an immediate opportunity to choose, do I want to go the sales route or do you want to go the operations route? And for me, one of the strong points for going the sales route was you got 5 suits and a company car. And I said, what a great thing coming out of college. I don't have any clothes and I don't have a car, so let's do that. And when I got down to my training facility down in Houston, Mike Wilson was the port manager down there. I was the first and only trainee ever in Houston. And Mike asked on the first day, well, are you here for sales or ops? And I said, I think sales. And he goes, good, we'll blow by all the ops stuff. You can go out with the commercial guys. We'll call it a day. I said, well, time out, Mike. I need to learn. And within a week, I said, I think I want to move over to ops. I really enjoyed it. And I've kind of sunk my career into the operating side of the business. And then as you progress through your career, you start to move into commercial support as the expert on the topic, or being able to support sales through some of their ventures. So it's been terrific.
Wow, that's incredible.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had no idea that you had an initial opening in sales in the commercial organization side of the industry and then pivoted pretty quickly.
Yeah, there's probably a lot of people that I've worked with in the commercial organization when young John started, said, I don't see how you could ever be a commercial person. But over time and different organizations and starting to work collectively as a team, providing a service. We're a service industry. And having that balance of operations and sales experience on both sides just made our products more impactful for our customers.
Well said, absolutely. So you mentioned, you were pretty open to being mobile right out of the get-go since you graduated. And I think in today's climate, we look around, and for various economic reasons, right? We see a lot of students and graduates stay home more around their support system and what they're comfortable with. Do you see that as limiting at all? Do you think there should be more of that, let's say, mobile mindset within younger professionals?
I could speak from my own experience, and that's something that's in my toolkit that'll never be taken away from me. It's different culture, it's different office, it's always meeting new people, but learning new environments and some of the just being on your own, away from mom and dad, I find those to be very helpful. With today's technology, there's a side of me that, kind of leans sometimes towards personal, I don't want to say sometimes leans towards, but personal happiness, right? So if somebody is got a reason they want to be by their parents. Maybe they're older, maybe they're sick, maybe there's some things they need to do. It's nice to have that flexibility. There's the big push post-COVID, get everybody into the office, right? I don't know. If I had somebody that worked for me and said, I don't feel safe in the office, I don't want to catch that disease, I'm like, then work from home. You're more productive when you're home. And, as I've moved throughout my career, I've done both. It's a special person that needs to be able to work from home to remain productive. But I found over time that people working from home sometimes work, longer hours. It's 7 o'clock at night. They're watching TV. Something's across their phone. They can just jump on it real quick. And, there's pros and cons to both of them. I prefer to explore the world, and my goal was to see most of the United States, which I have. And I also got some opportunities to visit other countries and spend some time, learn those cultures, and be there during interesting times in history where you go, I was there when Chavez was trying to take over Venezuela as a dictator.
Wow.
And almost got swooped up in the crowd. And, it was a very interesting time, but it's something I can always, pull back on and say, man, shipping was important, but what they were going through culturally was so much different and much more challenging than anything I was going through.
Wow. That is a very remarkable story. I'm curious if you can kind of expand upon that time, because I found it very just exciting hearing it.
Yeah, so, it's always nice to go to a location and have an in, somebody that's going to meet you. So, I had a person that worked for me while I was at Hamburg Süd who went back to Venezuela. We had to do some training down there on some of the systems with the people down there. And, we kind of got spread out to different locations. A couple went to Mexico, obviously some went to Hamburg. And John got drawn for Caracas, Venezuela, and showed up. I met my friend at the airport. I don't ever remember going through customs or anything. We just escorted directly to his car. And he put a pistol on the seat between us. And he said, we're going to go up the mountain. And it was the wild, wild west, driving on both sides of the road. We stopped for gas about halfway up. And I saw him hand a single bill to the gas attendant. And I said, wow, gas is fairly cheap here. He says, well, gas is free for us. That was just a tip for him to pump the gas. Wow. So went up, stayed at a very nice hotel in the middle of town. And the person that met me there said, hey, to the concierge, he said, do not let him outside. There's too much going on outside. And there were riots and protests staged from the day that I got there that got increasingly more dangerous every day.
Wow.
And by the third day, I was supposed to be there for 10. By the third day, people weren't showing up for the training sessions. And I asked my friend, I said, what's happening? He says, they're all out there. And you are a perfect person to be taken, which was happening down there in Venezuela at the time. That was an experience I didn't want to go through, and I wasn't really wandering around on my own, but I also know my own personality. I was probably going to venture out sooner or later. So I made a phone call back then. You had to ask permission to spend a little bit of extra money on your expense account, and I took a flight to come home. So that was pretty interesting. Similar experience in Guatemala in my time with Del Monte. There was some social unrest in Guatemala at the time, and I recall just trying to get some fresh air. At 10 o'clock at night, I woke up. I wasn't comfortable. I stepped outside my door, and it was the old-fashioned Holiday Inns with the catwalk right outside.
Sure, yes.
There was a gentleman standing there with a machine gun. And
Wow.
he said, where are you going? And I said, I'm just breathing in some fresh air. He goes, good, because you're not allowed to go left, right, or down. I said, okay, that's fine with me. But
Duly noted, right?
yeah, but when you're really focused on the work, you miss a lot of that, what's going on in the society around you, and you start to think about the labor and the workforce and the people that come to work and what they have to endure to get a job done. So, it just broadens your impact as a manager to be able to listen and understand what people might be going through to be more effective as a manager.
Well said, and hone in on that empathy piece for sure with the different people you're dealing with.
Empathy is the underlying word, and as I've progressed in my career, empathy has kind of moved to the top. When you're young and energetic and trying to prove your way to the top, not that you step on people on the way up, but you're really singularly focused about where you want to be. And there's missed opportunities for relationships and missed opportunities for understanding because you want to climb as fast and as far as you can. And as I've progressed into my career, empathy is high on my list, personally and professionally. You really don't know what another person is going through in their day-to-day job. When you walk out of a meeting and go, man, oh man, that was a rough one, and I don't understand why he reacted that way. And then you'll learn a little bit about the background, and you go, now I get it, I understand it. How do I manage through that with that person? And certainly, what can I do to help their life become a little bit easier?
Yeah, it's such an important skill to leverage for sure when you're dealing with people and different personalities, and it's not a cookie-cut kind of deal.
No.
You've spent a lot of time in international trade. I'm curious what lessons you learned in dealing with different cultures, with people that aren't necessarily even from this hemisphere. How can you relate to them? How can you make sure that the bottom line business priorities are getting addressed?
I think the first lesson I had in anything internationally was language, right? What's going to be the language barrier? And I was fortunate in almost all of them. The language of choice for the project or the meetings was always in English. But spending a lot of time in Germany, a lot of time in the Latin America countries. Fortunately, I took Spanish all the way through. I was really, really focused on Spanish when I was coming up through high school. And I was always way ahead because my two sisters had taken it before me.
Okay,
so
runs in the family.
I was speaking Spanish at a young age. You forget kind of how to speak it, but you learn how to understand it. And I focused on those skills. Now you have apps, if you're around. So culturally, doing your best to try to fit into that culture, ordering food at a restaurant, take a shot at it, right? And if you get it wrong, you've tried a new food that you probably didn't expect to try, right? But, those kind of cultures, work cultures are very different, I found in the positions I've been in, at least in the roles that I've been in, people will work until the job's done. And if that means 8 o'clock, and that's not everybody, but there are people that'll work 8 o'clock at night. There are certain cultures, 5 o'clock, wheels up, everybody's gone, and that's the way it is. And you just have to learn to relate to that and kind of, tailor your program or tailor your leadership or project, whatever you're working on, to the local culture, but also share your experience from where you've come from and where you've been. And I've been fortunate in that regard. I've touched a lot of different pieces of the process for international shipping. So I can talk about what it's like to work at 11 o'clock at night on a ship on the Delaware River.
Wow.
And it's real. I did it, so I'm not making it up. And I think people that provide the empathy and reverse back to you, all of a sudden now you got a really good working relationship and you can move on whatever challenge is in front of you.
Yeah, snowballs from there.
Exactly.
Good point. It's curious. You started really fresh out of college and you kind of had to learn the industry for a few years.
Sure did.
And you obviously have a lot of aspirations and you're a career-driven person, but I'm curious, when at a point in your career did you feel comfortable enough to take that ability on a technical level and translate it to a potential team, moving yourself into a leadership capacity?
Early on in my career, I went from Houston, Texas to Oakland, California, far away from home. It's the labor situation nobody ever talks about, but it's more difficult than LA and can be more difficult than Los Angeles and Long Beach. And I was put in a position where I was in charge of ILA labor for receiving and delivering as a supervisor. So you come out, you're a supervisor, and the manager left 2 months after I was out there in Oakland. And U.S. Lines was going through some difficult times, but for me it was opportunity. They said, would you like to take a shot at man? Yes. And, I didn't really, these were career ILA, ILWU type people. They had 40 years experience. I had 7 months. And I took the time to learn from them and really wanted to understand the history of the waterfront in Oakland because they were happy to tell me about it. But I wasn't teaching anybody at that point in time. From there, it was a lot of hands-on experience and just putting that into the library in the back of me, until I had my first real opportunity with non-organized labor office type people. That probably happened at Mitsui. I was asked to move from the corporate office that we had just got up and standing from its agency relationships to go to Chicago and took over a team. And I had my process and my skill set that I wanted to introduce, and that first one probably didn't go so smooth, but I had the built trust with everybody that worked for me, and I trusted them. I wasn't in a position to go in and make wholesale. I made some wholesale changes that needed to be made, and they were mandated to me to make these changes. But I really got to know the people and what makes them tick and what are their strengths and weaknesses, and just tried to always build a program around those strengths and weaknesses and leverage my experience and their experience to keep going into that library that I hold inside, my toolkit.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And I guess listening was a key component early on with that change of you evolving into a manager.
It's the most underdeveloped skill that I had to get to coming out of college and going through the training program. Most younger people, I know that. I can do that. It's not a problem. And as things get more complex or have larger financial responsibility or transformational organizational responsibility, you really have to listen. And I think what made me a better listener over time was my adherence to process, to really understand process and to live in a continuous process improvement environment and try to bring that wherever I go. You've been through process, you might have been through some process mapping sessions with me, and they were all about listening. And it's really playing the Columbo method. You listen to the expert. This is what I heard. Is that what you said? And trying to map that through. I found that to be the most impactful for me into developing to be a better listener. And, that is also in my personal life. When you have an experience, a lot of times it's easy to just cut somebody off and say, I know where this is going, here's the answer, let's move forward. But I've learned you need to let the people get it out. You need to listen to make sure that you're hearing it correctly. And then you need to pull that all together and say, let's take a path forward and work on this one together. And build up everybody's confidence and build future leaders.
Well said. Last one on this early entry conversation. With today's young professionals that are just graduating college and joining an organization in shipping, transportation, or elsewhere, because everyone is so spread out now and a lot of employees and their even colleagues are remote, do you think there's a lack of that training comprehension that comes with that new integration versus when you perhaps started with an organization that was very close-knit with your team?
It was boot camp, right? So you were around, you were part of a class. Maybe you weren't together all the time. I had a class that part of them were in Savannah, some were all over the country. I happened to be in Houston, and we got together occasionally to compare notes. I see a lot of scholastic aptitude that's coming out of the schools now for most of the young people that come to me. And, I think explaining your experience and making it colorful to somebody coming right out of school, it could be a funny story about Venezuela or something like that. It's funny now. It wasn't funny then.
I can imagine.
But explaining that experience, generally you get some listening. And, then all of a sudden now you have a relationship and you can kind of transform book knowledge, school knowledge into practical knowledge based on experience that I have. And I've had good fortune. I've had some really people that have been now promoted throughout the through different organizations. And it's so happy for me to see that transition has taken place. It's kind of watching a little bit of your own past and watching people move up the ranks, and you're like, yes, we did something right. And I say we because it was me and a few others at different organizations, and there were several places where I felt we just had the A-team. We had a collection of subject matter experts and people that had gone through chaos to build a very stable organization with a very high-value product, and they were all very good, and they were very good at turning that information over to others.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree with that more. And it sounds like mentorship was certainly a focus of even your second half, part of your career. What are some tips for someone trying to seek out a mentor in their career, someone that could guide them through different steps of their professional journey, let's say?
I think you have to read the organization that you're working for and see what kind of people are there. Do your homework on LinkedIn, look up and see what their experience has been. but reach out. I think that, there's nothing more flattering, I think, for a person that's been around the industry to have somebody knock on their door one day or catch them in the parking lot and say, hey, listen, I'd like to talk to you about this point in your career, or I saw you in a meeting and you were speaking about this particular topic. Before you know it, you have a relationship and you're mentoring. It's been part of my DNA. Athletics is a big part of my background, and
Sure.
I was, fortunate to move through athletics, always in a leadership role, always as a captain, through college, all those kind of things. And, when you're a senior and you're playing NCAA hockey and you have a bunch of freshmen show up, got to teach them the ropes, right? So you don't step on the ice with your blades covered still and you fall on your face.
Are you speaking from personal experience, John?
Personal experience, one or two times, right? But it's, I've always had that, and part of my upbringing was, try to understand what other people are going through, try to make people feel comfortable all the time. And I think, reaching out, having these types of conversations with people helps both parties grow, right? So when you look back, in sessions like this, you look back on your career and you can say, wow, I really had a pretty decent run so far, and I got a lot of gas left in the tank. What's next, right?
Well said. Absolutely. That's great. So just shifting more to the supply chain and logistics part of your career, you've obviously had really high stakes positions in different ways, and TT&I, CMA, I mean, the list goes on and on at this point, Hamburger Sid, obviously. What are some of the biggest challenges you faced in terms of dealing with the finances of a department or a team that you're involved with, and kind of weighing those, economic elements?
Yeah, and it's interesting because, I always heard early on when I had budgetary responsibility, it's a cyclical environment. It's going to right-size itself. At the same time, we need to reduce costs by 10% year over year. I mean, it just never stopped. And, I was one of those people that fought it hard when I was younger. If you do 10% every year, eventually you're going to get to zero, right?
Sure.
And that's not the case. It took a long while to prove me to that. But to really understand how the finances work, finding somebody in the financial world that can validate your assumptions and being collectively working with them towards savings programs. And that's where I spent a lot of my time, on cost savings programs. And, I was guided, from a mentor, Mr. Wilson, Mike Wilson. And we always talked about if you're always focused on finance, that's the only goals you're going to achieve. So we always had organizational goals and then personal goals. So,
Sure.
You kind of labeled those out together, so you always felt that you were moving forward. And trackable, measurable events in cost savings are real. And, they need to show up on the balance sheet. And I think over time, we got away from, well, I saved $1 million, but you spent $1 million, so what good was that? To work collectively with other groups to really push an organization forward. I've been fortunate to have that happen a few different times and continue to have it happen. And it's something I drive for, is let's take a look at the whole view and get that holistic view of the business. Where do I have control? What can I control? And where do I need help? Where do I need, commercial support to make my empty repositioning just look a little bit better? So, those kind of things. You have those kind of discussions with commercial people, build that trust, build that relationship, and all of a sudden you're sailing towards, hey, we're gonna go after an account a little bit harder, maybe toy with the rates a little bit, but its overall benefit to the organization is positive. So let's move forward with this.
Wow, and it sounds like it's much more collaborative too than
absolutely
looking at things in the siloed blocks.
Yeah, and it's dangerous to be in that siloed block, whether it's process development or cost control. Very dangerous to do that on your own. And I would caution any organization and places where I've worked, we can't do this alone. This is not just operational savings. This is organizational beneficial impact, whether it be customer service, cost savings, early on in my career, and it happens in a lot of organizations that I've been in. You see this a lot, sales and ops.
Right.
And I like this a lot better. Sales and ops work together. And probably a few salesmen that'll listen to this and say, No, he didn't. But the truth of the matter is I did. And it took a little while to mature and to get there, have that empathy to move forward with those programs.
Well said. Great. So, procurement plays such an important role in logistics, and you've had a lot of experience there. Can you just speak about some of the negotiation tactics or what you did to really build that supply relations?
A lot of the relationships I have built over years are still close relationships. And, organizational size and the contractor network that you deal with is always going to be relative. So, I spent a lot of years, no mistake, I spent a lot of years with Hamburg Süd, and we were able to build relationships with mid or small size carriers, talking mostly in the trucking community, and really develop a service quality aspect with those particular carriers. Some other companies, it's been big ones, but I think, again, the listening skill comes in. It's very important to listen. I think the mature step has become to understand that if they don't make money, doesn't matter what I do, they're not going to be around.
Good
so
point.
You have to find that sweet spot where you're sensitive to their financial position, but also they're sensitive to yours. I can remember back in 2009 financial crisis, right? We got a call from Hamburg saying every vendor 10% cut on rates.
Wow.
And if they don't take it on, they're not a vendor anymore. It was a very simple call, right? So we'd had good relationships for years. Said, hey guys, we're on tough times, so we need your support now. Very few that we had to kick to the curb.
Is that right? Wow.
Yeah. Now, most organizations, particularly in the ocean carrier world, have become more developed, right? So buying and approving are not in the same silo anymore, which is good, very good. But procurement was new, since I've been on board, and it's pretty hard sometimes because procurement in itself is a skill. It is a strategy. It is, something that needs to be developed, and it may not lean towards relationships from the very beginning. A lot of it is cost. You need to get to the right cost, and I think, the closeness of operations and logistics teams with that procurement group to understand the softer side of a vendor, why they're important or why they're worth a little bit more or why they're expendable. Those kind of things in those discussions. And it really helps the overall relationship with the vendor world is to know that it's a two-pronged approach. It works together. There's certain things I can do and there's certain things I can't do. And, I think it's been successful and it's still maturing.
Right,
I think procurement is still on the maturity roll. Some organizations more than others, but it's still something that has a lot more room to grow and probably a lot more pull away from middle level and top level operations where they can focus more on customer success, how to build the product around the customer, and then take it to a pricing model. So, the old adage is, you don't always give the customer what they want, you give the customer what they pay for. So as long as that's transparent through the entire operation, I found that to be the most successful.
That's such a good point in looking at things holistically versus in a vacuum there, yeah. So, when I first started in shipping, John, there was such an emphasis on data and data management and looking at spreadsheets and dashboards and the like and making decisions based off that. But the longer I've been in transportation, I've also seen a real value in intuition and having experience to leverage that. So I'm curious, what's your interplay between, I guess, intuition and data in terms of decision making?
I had to learn that data drives behavior, right? So, when I joined almost every organization I've been a part of, the saying is data's a mess. Well, data's only a mess because it's not being used. The systems aren't being used, or there's not a standard process. There's more than one source of truth. So going through that transformation, single sources of truth, process that drive clean data, allow you to make very good decisions. But a lot of us, myself included, I'm not a schooled business analyst, and I think bringing in people and you're familiar with a couple of those people that came in as business analysts. They really open your eyes to things. And I think, the further I've moved in my career, that's probably been the most important position next to me.
Wow.
Is somebody that can help me see where the problems are in the data. We always talked about, and I still do talk about, there's the physical movement of a shipment that I can envision. I see how it's going to move. Then there's the data points that are on a similar parallel to those physical movements that you have to capture. And the more you can capture with accuracy, the better you're going to be at solving problems, dealing with customer issues, and being able to, again, insert continuous process improvement, saying that was the piece that was broke, here's where we fixed it, and continue to move on. So I'm a huge fan of data and analysts. My experience, my intuition is going to lead me so far. And we talked for a couple of minutes before this started, and I said, it's okay to say sometimes I don't know. And I think that's, when I first came into the industry, I don't remember hearing anybody say I don't know. And that could just be that they were great, But, I think there were a lot of times we did things because we didn't have either the ability based on time or constraints or we didn't have the data, right?
Right.
We would go on intuition and maybe it was wrong. Today, I think you can make, and now with AI, some of the predictive analytics, and we have to embrace them. The people that have been in the industry, like myself, you can't outrun it. It's here. So, manual to basic Microsoft products like Excel and other things, to now moving into AI, which we explored in my last couple of roles and in the role I'm in today. AI is something.
How do you see that, on your point, reshaping logistics in terms of the decision making, or just perhaps making employees more efficient?
I think it makes them more efficient. AI, if you just take it for what it's worth, you'll end up in a blunder sooner or later, whether it's writing a paper or trying to analyze some data. But it allows it to format it into a position for you to look at and say, wow, that saved me 6 hours of scrumming through a bunch of data that I didn't really understand, or what I was looking for, I didn't know where it was. And it gives you to a concise format to get back to the collaborative. I don't think we're totally AI ready yet as an industry, and I'm not sure what industries are, but I know our industry, you still need that human interaction, that team interaction, and, quite honestly, that quiet time where you can just, embrace yourself in a spreadsheet, if you will, and kind of look through the data and say, okay, here's where I am, here's where I want to get to, what's going to help me get there, and then polling people along the way to help you get there.
Makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
How did you see, I guess, the acceleration of digitalization impacting day-to-day business since COVID?
You had to have it, right? Because there was so many moving parts during COVID, whether it was demurrage, detention, excess equipment, systems not working, whatever, remote systems maybe not working. Man, did we really have to rely on data and scrub data real time, to make sure that it was true and accurate. I know a lot of what we did in that first round of COVID with an ocean carrier was a challenge for everybody. Again, new team, and in an organization much different than where I came from, where people were deep domain experts, and there wasn't a lot of lateral movement in people with that expertise. And in organizations, the top carriers, there's a lot of that lateral movement that happens. So, my experience in being able to touch a lot of those was able to drive some consistency, getting to that dashboard world where you can kind of see what the business looks like through the numbers and be able to react and make changes. But COVID was tough. When I also moved on to the BCO side during COVID and saw the other side of it, warehouses that were full, containers that were piled up inside of a particular customer. We had, when I arrived the first day, I had to make a left onto the the campus to get to my position, and I saw this yard just filled up with containers.
Oh, jeez.
And they're all sitting on pool chassis.
Oh, goodness.
And I said, man, this isn't good. And, went through the first part of that normal orientation. We want to show you your benefits. I said, guys, I really, I'll come back tonight. We can do this at night, but I need to go out there and see what's going on.
Bigger fish to fry.
We had, a lot of different stuff, and, we brought everybody together and said, hey, I don't know the exact dollar, but that's costing us a fortune, and we have to find something to put together. So we were able to collectively as a group understand one problem and where were the lead-ins to that problem. And what we found is we had too much freight, right? And I think a lot of companies found that out during COVID. Their supply chain strategies of, really had to go through some changes, and lead times of 70, 80, 90 days worth of it, you don't need it, right? So it was working further into the organization and people purchasing from Asia saying, we got 2 warehouses full of this, slow it down a little bit. So really a lot of the smaller pieces of the business, and much like other parts of my career, sharing my pain points with people that I thought might be contributing to them, and just trying to build that working group and say, how do we get better at what we do? And within 3 months' time, we had no detention and demurrage. We had a process that contributed to 0 detention and demurrage. At one point, we were in excess of $200,000 a day. That was costing us, down to 0. And if we did have any detention and demurrage, it was chosen to be that way because the cost of transportation was more than the actual detention and demurrage. So, you built up the confidence of that group to say, that's okay, we don't need to bring that empty back today. We'll bring tomorrow because I can match another load from the port. And seeing people learn, again, back to my coaching background, watching people learn and grow and get it was fantastic.
That's phenomenal.
It's just another tool in the toolkit that you say, I'll save this away for another day. And guess what? The position I'm in now with Port City Logistics, that's exactly what we're going through.
Wow.
A team and a company that's ready for expanded growth, has really, really good people, and now we have to find a way to scale that and move it through. So I'm happy to be there for that role, to help other markets or other products or get better at what we do. So, the role is business development. Most people relate that strictly to a commercial role. This is developing the business for Port City Logistics, and I love it. I mean, it's a big change, but it's a familiar change with people that I'm very comfortable with and very happy to work with.
And I'm sure they're equally lucky to have you, for sure, John.
It's great.
I've always been impressed with the nose you have of finding cost-saving opportunities with companies you're in. Have you always had that strategic mindset? Is that something you kind of learned over time?
I've always looked at trying to break things down to simplicity, right, and cut waste. And, it probably started in my athletic career. And then as I moved into coaching, you get into a lot of positions where, you have 200 players trying out for 15 slots on a team, and you have to find the right pieces that fit in to make that team produce, right? I kind of just shifted the pieces when I got into the business world of saying, we're spending a lot of money. A lot of it was guided at first. I fortunate opportunity to work with Mike and Mike Wilson, and we would look at cost and we would look at what's the biggest, most impactful. Oh, it's aged equipment. Okay, where does that fit in the process of the day-to-day? Okay, it's a data review. We have to make sure it's true and it's accurate. And you just, you start that ball rolling. You get a people to reach out and take a hold of the ball, and all of a sudden your aging is going down. DSO, we worked on it with accounts payable. Well, who has the best relationship with the motor carrier? Maybe not a collections person. Maybe it's somebody on, in John's team or John himself. So we start to work on those things. So it's that, again, collaborative environment where you can start to put the pieces together. But it takes a few people to drive the collaboration and find out, I can't stress importance of process and understanding where things are in the process and being able to pull it out and say, deep dive this one. I think there's something in there for us.
Looking at the details with a little more scrutiny.
The devil's in the details, right?
For sure. What's the role of networking in terms of being successful in transportation and shipping, and how have you built out your own network in terms of just making it more broad and more expansive to get other people, not perhaps even in operations, but the commercial side?
It's a great question because, there are people that are really good at networking. You can put them in a New York Traffic Club meeting or a State of the Port in Georgia, and they naturally move around a room and network and get to meet people. That wasn't always a comfortable spot for me. Most of my networking has been done through projects I've worked on, companies I've worked for, and just, trying to keep yourself consistent in your approach. Always try to be fair, and it kind of rises its way to just meeting people throughout the chain. And it's funny, who you meet today that is just in a support role on a project that you're working on. I had this happen with CCM, all of a sudden became my largest vendor.
Wow.
So the transition
Wow.
was relatively simple. It was like, hey, I know you from before, but this is what we're doing right now. And, you're able to deep dive and get into it relatively quick. And you don't realize, at least for me, looking at LinkedIn and you look at how many connections do you have. My daughter's always impressed saying, you have, endless connections. And I go, yeah, there's just, some people that I know. And I don't really look at it as a network. And it wasn't strategic that I need to have 1,000, or anything like that. It was just, I've been afforded a lot of opportunity to be in a lot of different places, and working for different organizations on different projects to meet a lot of people. And I can't think of any that were just so unsuccessful that I didn't meet anybody. I always met people along the way, and you never know when you're going to have to pick up the phone and say, hey, I need some help on this one. And that's usually the conversation. It is, right? You're dealing with something, you met somebody. I don't really carry a Rolodex, but I'll look around and say, I met a guy when I was here, and he's responsible for this. All of a sudden now you're rekindling a relationship, and all of a sudden there's a nugget there. And and it happens in reverse, the other way. I have a lot of people that reach out to me. I still have people that reach out to me from 4 positions ago.
Wow.
That just say, hey, I had your phone number. I need help with a release at Mar Terminal. And I go, yeah, I don't really do that anymore, but I know who does, right? So I can immediately make the connection. I understand their challenge. It's immediate. It's a cost impact item for them. And if I can help, I help.
And it flows almost organically nowadays with that stuff.
Exactly.
Makes a lot of sense, yeah. It's curious, John, in terms of your history and where you are and where you are today. If you reflect back, what are some pieces of advice you might share with your younger self in terms of setting yourself up for more success, or looking at things with a perhaps different perspective?
I think the hands-on experience that I've had for most of my career has been so beneficial. That's one of the standout points for me is, I've always been I got to be able to touch it first, and relinquishing that attitude as you move through different careers and move through different channels makes it more and more difficult, and you actually get pressure from above saying, get out of the day-to-day, you need to be more strategic. So early on in my career, I'm not sure if there's anything I would change, to be honest. I think
it's a good peace of mind to have.
I again, fortunate for the positions that I was in, but I think that advice to somebody coming through, touch it, feel it, go out, smell it, get run over by it, get hit by it, don't get hurt, but have it smack you around for a little while, and guess what? You'll really become an expert in that piece, and it'll come back to you later in your life. I think mid-career was that evolution from touch it, feel it to providing strategy and leadership and growth. That is, I have a mentor. There's somebody I can reach to, and I think kind advice to anybody coming into the career, find that person. And it may change, people have spiritual advisors and addictions, advisors and sponsors and those kind of people, and they may change over time, but always have a person you can lean into. And it's usually going to be somebody you met early on in your career that is moving in the same path and shares common culture, common values, those kind of things. I wished I learned to say when I need help on something. It was a badge of honor to limp into the boardroom and say, yeah, I was up until 2 a.m. putting this together, and I bang. You don't have to do that anymore, right? There's people out there, and leaning to help doesn't always mean putting your hand up for somebody. It's a lot of times, and some of the most successful ones that I've had is finding somebody on your team to say, I've had it. I can't do this anymore. I need to give this to you. And they give it back to you better than you were doing it yourself. I still think back to our original process mapping at Hamburg Süd. The first process we took on was load centering or vessel closeout. And I took my expert, Donna Anderson, and I said, give me a full detail of what you do. It was 6 steps. In her brain, it was 6 steps. Ended up being 42. When we really analyzed it and went through it. So something so simple to somebody, there's a lot of information in there. Take the time to build it and drive it out. Because you know what? She was pretty proud when she was done to say, wow, I do all that. I really do all that. And for me, as watching a person and their career grow, that was a trajectory that I don't think she ever expected to happen. And again, proud moment for me to say, you were frontline, moved into management because of your expertise, and then blossomed through an organizational change, and brought that skill into the organization that purchased Hamburg Süd. So it was really, really, really happy for me to see something like that.
I can't imagine how rewarding that must have been to see that evolution for sure.
And it's happening. People that I'm meeting now at some of these companies are part of my teams or close groups that I had worked with before, like yourself. And watching them grow is just, it is just the cherry on top of the whipped cream. Again, I keep reaching back to say I've had a very fortunate career. I've worked for those opportunities, but and I think a lot of people will say this, I was in the right place at the right time. I always like when things are a little bit chaotic. Chaos is good in my book because it's a field for improvement. It's okay. I can unleash that toolkit and start to put these things to work because they've been dry for a little while. When things are running smooth, I get itchy. It's
too mundane.
But that's the time to dig back into continuous process improvement. You look at processes related back to cost, productivity, product development, whatever they might be. You start to look at those and collaborate with others and say, where do we need to get better, right? So if it's cost, I start to reach into those funnels and say, where do we need to go? We developed some. Look at what we did with forecasting at Hamburg Süd.
Absolutely.
Forecasting was, and it still is, a major challenge wherever you go. We had a good process. Why? Because we had that back and forth challenge where everybody stripped off their titles and we got into a room and said, we need to be X% accurate 6 weeks out. Everybody said, no way you can do it. Guess what? We did it. Because it was a lot of informational share. There was a lot of systematic share. There was a lot of knowledge share. And we put it together, and guess what? We got better. Lowered our cost, improved the availability to our customers. It's a huge success story that most people that were involved in it probably go, yeah, it happened, but not really sure.
Yeah.
Huge.
There was such a commitment to the mission there, for sure. And obviously the end result was just profound.
Yeah.
So going back to your comment about chaos, one of the things I've always been impressed with you, John, is your even keelness. Despite all the craziness that might be happening, the profundity of chaos that might be materializing on a day-out, day level. Have you always been that way? Is that just your personality? Is that a muscle you had to develop over time?
I think I've always been that way. I've probably, at some point in my youth, I learned that getting crazy about something that I can't control, probably upbringing. My dad was a little bit of a hothead, but at the end of the day, he was a person I could look up to because he didn't falter in times of crisis. And as I got older, I just started to, grow a little bit internally, and I focused on the things that I can control. The things that were outside of my control, they were kept in the margin. And if I found somebody that controlled those, I would say, here, this is one I can't control, but it's in my
Scope.
area of scope right now. And I've tried to focus on that, and it's helped me grow. I know when I first came into the industry, the yelling and screaming as part of management, part of coaching. I always reacted to that. When I had the Herb Brooks type coach that you were fearful every time you stepped on the ice.
Sure.
And it worked for me. It worked for some of the teams that I coached when I first started. But then as generations started to come through, I realized, they don't react that way anymore. And there's a different approach that needs to happen. And I had to tailor my coaching around it, or choose to not coach. I just say, maybe this isn't for me, maybe I can't change. But I've always been pretty confident in my abilities, and know that I have a resource to go to or resources to go to for help. And, a person that is losing their cool or losing their composure in times of crisis, generally, you watch Band of Brothers, right? What happens in Band of Brothers? Somebody else takes over because the leader's getting everybody killed. And I never want to be that person. I always want to be able to say, hey guys, let's take a piece of it. If we fix a piece today, take another piece tomorrow, and we'll continue and continue and continue and get the buy-in of the team. I think if people trust you, if people understand that you are a leader, that you're okay to take it on your shoulders and, kind of protect them from some of the chaos that's going on right now, give them a chance to work, collaborate, and put the program together, before you know it, the chaos is over.
Well said. Makes a lot of sense. And just expanding that a bit, in terms of how you critique people on your team, obviously it's a much different style today than perhaps it was when you first joined transportation logistics many decades ago. So how do you go about that? Is it a soft approach? Do you kind of do it with more data that's backing certain criticisms?
It depends on the condition that we're trying to, or maybe it's a behavior, maybe it's a process adherence, whatever it is. So I try to identify what it is, and then I prefer the soft approach. I prefer to call somebody inside or call them on the phone and say, hey, listen, here's the situation, here's the error, and this is what we're going to need to do to correct it. And, I always, again, I'm here to help you. I've been in your shoes, and I've had every one of those jobs. So, it might be different, the system might be different, but at the end, fundamental of moving A to B, kind of understand how that works. You have me as a resource, but I can give you somebody else on the team that might be able to help you even more. Maybe they develop a mentor and leadership relationship at that point in time. I think it's important, but I think dealing with it directly and right away is probably the biggest key. You can't let things fester. I've watched a couple of the other sessions that you've put together. When I was at Hamburg Süd, we closed 7 or 8 offices in the course of a year and a half, and we acquired that many companies or more in the same period of time. So there were a lot of layoffs, and there were a lot of uncomfortable situations. But everybody was clear of what the goal was, right? There was no surprises. There was always a communication of risk. And those, I use those sayings in every team that I work with. Bad news doesn't get better over time. Communicate the risk, right? You need to raise your hand and say, nobody might like it, but hear about it sooner. And there was, Jürgen Plump used to say all the time, I want to hear from you before I hear from the customer. Wow. And that's something, inside of an organization, if you can build that inside of your operating group, customer service has a role, and that's normally the catch for that role. You can build that inside of operations, where they're customer aware, product aware, and they can say, hey, Ted, your account, we were late for the pickup today. Here's what we're doing to recover from it. Still going to make the ship, blah, 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 blah. But you're informing him before the customer picks up the phone and calls Ted and says, you guys missed my pickup today. So I think that's important to get the buy-in from the team that at the end of the day, we're a service. we are not a cost-saving center. We're not a revenue center.
Right.
We are a service, and we need to offer and give customers what they pay for. They want more. Explain exactly what we're going to be able to provide, and provide it.
Well said, absolutely. And you're right, going back to the timeliness piece, that's probably more important than anything else
Address it
in
right
addressing
away.
those things, yeah.
If you can. I mean, sometimes, a lot of teams, you refer to the floor. The opportunity might not be there, but, at least at the end of the day, latest the next morning, send them a note overnight, send them a note at the end of the day, hey, just come in and see me before tomorrow starts. Try not to do that so you give anxiety over the night as
Sure.
much as you can, but, you have to have those conversations. And, not everybody is cut for this business, and I respect that. We had a timetable on positions. When we start to get really good at what we're doing, you would say, okay, 6 weeks. If they're not inside the TP inside of 6 weeks, it's just a matter of time, right? So, but that's experience. You're lucky to have that. And again, managing and developing teams is something I really enjoy personally and professionally.
Yeah, you've certainly got a knack for that.
Yeah.
I think a lot of us, when we start working, regardless of industry really, we have a trajectory of what our career is going to be. And then a lot of times, something externally will influence that, and we have to react and change to it accordingly. It could be in a very tight window, it could be more elongated. I'm curious how you've dealt with change in your career, whether it's companies or things happening to you where you've had to adapt. What are some tips that you could share to folks on that subject?
I think immerse yourself in the culture. Make sure the culture is correct for you. Everything isn't a perfect fit for, there are people that like to work alone and work in an environment where it's 100% KPI driven and there's no interaction to talk otherwise. You either did or you didn't. Mm-hmm. I realized part of that is correct for me, but I need to be around people. I think developing people and certainly trying to always backfill my position has always been very important to me. Who's going to take the lead when we used to say when somebody got hit by a bus, now we say whoever wins the lottery. If they win the lottery and they don't show up, what are we going to do with that position?
Well, that's morbid of a metaphor.
Yeah, exactly. I've just been fortunate in that regard.
Makes a lot of sense. So as we begin to wrap things up here, what's kind of your elevator pitch to someone who's interested in joining logistics but perhaps on the fence about it? What kind of excites you about transportation?
That it never changes, and it's always going to be there. There's not a world that I envision that you don't have to move product from A to B, right? Whether it's by ship, train, plane, truck, some AI-driven vehicle, whatever it might be, there's always going to be a need for it, right? And, you can talk about tariffs and influence of the government and all that stuff that's going on. There's going to be a need for people that enjoy what they do and understand that it's going to be there forever, and it is ever evolving. The range of products that are supplied, acquisitional growth by ocean carriers stemming off into other pieces of the transportation chain, supply chain. 10 years ago, not a lot of people were talking about supply chain. And now when I've had the chance to experience it on the BCO side, boy, is it a critical role, and really understanding lead times and production and changes to line and manufacturing and how does that fit into a campaign. There's the opportunities are endless. And, for me, I've been able to bounce from ocean carrier to supplier to ocean carriers to BCO. And to have those kind of experiences, foundationally, if you're a logistics expert or following that career path, your opportunities are endless. I mentioned to you on the way in, I had somebody that was a trainee that worked for me at Mitsui when I was in Chicago, is now in a lead procurement role for Coca-Cola. I wasn't a part of his journey growth, but to look that up and go, wow, man, did he go from basically what he did was verified detention invoicing with that it was the correct amount going to the correct bill to party, to heading up procurement for Coca-Cola. Wow, tremendous. And you couldn't talk about what was the ladder to get from there to there. I'll be having that conversation with him in a couple of weeks' time, and I'm really curious as to how did he grow? because I didn't hear from him. So it wasn't my mentoring or anything. I don't feel bad about that, but he obviously got, an area to expand and grow, and, now he has a team, and hopefully he's doing the same thing.
And I'm sure you planted some seeds back then, too, that helped evolve him to where he is today.
Yeah, and that was, that was a chaotic time when I grew there. It was, it was a major steamship line that said, we're going to go on our own. And a handful of us worked in the World Trade Center in New York City, and we stood up a steamship line, with 5 goats and a chicken. We got it all put together, and then once it was all put together in corporate, they said, go here. And, Brian Darnowski went to Atlanta, has had a successful career. John Trent went to Seattle, successful career. John Donahue went to Chicago, and then started on his journey. And it was, wow, it's been quite a ride. And again, I'm not done yet. I still have a lot of gas in the tank. I think this current position for me is a challenge, and I'm grateful to have that challenge. It's exciting. It's something that, it doesn't keep me up at night with worry. It keeps me up at night occasionally. My wife might defer to something different, but I look forward to that next day. I'm look like, what's the next thing? What can we do to really wow it? And being around a different geography. It's a southern-based company in Savannah. Things are different. Southern people are different than us Northeasterners, right?
Thankfully.
They're, well, to a certain extent. And I think the blend is good. So, yeah, I'm excited for whatever direction this venture takes me. I think my toolkit is not completely full, but it's certainly there to lend to people at any role in any organization, and people I've touched in my career, to say, here's how I would have dealt with that. And, just by sharing that, they might just say, that's exactly what I'm not going to do. That's okay. At least it gives you a choice, and to have choices is very important.
Well, we're all excited to watch you in your next chapter, which sounds really exciting, and there's a lot of optimism surrounding that, for sure.
Yeah, I want to thank you. This was tremendous. I really enjoyed speaking with you today. Again, to anybody that may be watching it, that was part of my team at some point in time, or has touched my career, that is looking for some nugget of information in there. When early on in my career, I was able to attend a lot of dinners, people retiring. I was around a lot of older people.
Interesting.
And you'd hear the stories, my days on the waterfront. And I used to roll my eyes and say, man, I hope I'm never that guy telling the stories at the dinner. Well, guess what?
Full circle.
I'm the guy a lot of times telling those stories, but a lot of those stories catch attention to people. Say, wow, you were in Venezuela when there was a dictatorship just about ready to happen. And that just fosters a conversation, and that's where a lot of the mentoring has come through, is that silly story, running bananas through the fields of Costa Rica. How did that happen? Oh, I'll tell you how it happened. This is exactly what I did. But it's to look back on that, I look back on it with pride, and I look back on it with the tremendous relationships I've been able to build.
Without question. Yeah, phenomenal anecdotes that you're able to share, which I always appreciate whenever we talk about the past there. But so thankful for your area of expertise today and the lessons sharing that you were able to mention. And sincerely wish you well in your next step, John.
Thank you, Sean, and good luck in your new position.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks, bud.